Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast with Zach Bitter. For our listeners who are less familiar, you want to just kind of share a little bit about your background when you kind of started getting curious about nutrition relative to endurance and kind of what your lead into it all was?
Yeah, so probably like most runners of my age, I'm 55, we were all raised, we were just, burning bagels, right? It was all carb loading, carb loading, carb loading. That's how we rolled. And most of us were pretty well and young, so you could get away with it. And that's kind of, how I approach nutrition. We were all taught in medical school, calories, calorie, energy in, energy out, burn more than you eat if you need to lose weight. I was in the military and I didn't have a problem with my weight. So I figured that must be true. And I'd advise my patients the same. When I moved from Colorado to West Virginia, when I worked in Colorado and certainly when I worked active duty for the military as a flight doc, obesity was really not what I saw every day. But then when I got back to West Virginia here, I'm a professor at WVU School of Medicine. It was like all obesity and diabetes in the clinic and the hospital. And that advice never worked, but I didn't at once think that I was wrong in the advice. I just figured, this was just people couldn't eat less and move more. But then in about 2012, I was brought on back to active duty for 6 months to work on a project for the Air Force related to fitness tests because they had changed the standards. And the run was 60% of the test now. And if you failed the run, you failed the test. So I was brought on as kind of the running specialist to try to help the Air Force learn how to run better. But I dug into the data on why people failed the test, Zach, and obesity showed up as the biggest marker, not whether they did PT or not, is were they carrying body weight. And you had time, so I just kind of started browsing things, reading things, and I came across just stuff that blew my mind. Came across Gary Taubes's original article in the New York Times Magazine, Maybe It's All Been a Big Fat Lie, and I read that article and I was like, wow, that kind of makes scientific sense. It was a maybe 10-page article. And then I bought his book, which is 450 pages, Good Calories, Bad Calories, read that like 3 times. And then kind of the short story of it, I traveled to like 50 military bases. And I would always ask, these are people who failed the test. So they're sitting at a base gym and they're like, they don't want to be there, right? You're the guy, here's this skinny runner guy trying to tell us to run more, but, have some fun with them, right? And you'd always ask the question at the beginning of the seminar, has anyone lost 50 pounds and kept it off for a year? One hand would go up, maybe a couple, and you'd ask what they did. Across the board, it was some low carb variety. They'd say, well, I'm doing paleo. And 10 years ago, paleo was not the paleo aisle of Whole Foods, with processed shit. It was, they ate meat and they ate some vegetables, right? That was paleo. They got rid of sugar, so they, got rid of just sugar in all forms, especially the drinks. And occasionally someone say, they knew I was a doc. They were afraid I'd yell at them, but they said, that I did Atkins, and they would say that. And then they're just like, yeah, that's cool. That's fine. What you say in here stays in here. So that was like validation and just chain of events at the same time. I had my own lab work done, it's active duty. You get your labs done. And my A1C was in the mid 6 range, which was right at the diabetes threshold. And did a bunch of tests on me and put a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. And I was developing the type 1 spectrum. So I was barely making enough insulin to stay out of the full diabetic range. And in the Air Force, if you're fully diabetic or you're on diabetes medicines, you have to go through a medical board because you're not deployable in the position I was in. So I had to, if I hadn't done all that work reading about obesity and low carb diets, for the job I was doing, with the Air Force, I never would have had the confidence to say, well, hell, I need to do this, right? Because like when I saw that, I'm like, well, I need to just stop the carbohydrates and see what happens. And started checking my sugars 3 to 4 times a day and was able to bring my sugars into a safe range by doing that. And that was over 10 years ago. And, it changed everything about the way my body worked with nutrition and running, so it took a few years of adaptation, but, going back into the lab and the exercise physiology labs, doing VO2 max testing, most people flipped, and, you've done this testing with the faster trial. Most people flipped to carb oxidation at about 40% of their VO2 max, right? You're burning the log and now you're burning matches, so you got this fat engine but you just can't produce ATP quick enough, so you got to shift to sugar. But I was last time I was tested, it was after my 50th birthday. I was up at about 90% of my VO2 max, still burning fat, which is a wonderful place to be. And that was at a VO2 max of about 65. So that means you can run like 6-minute pace without needing a power bar or a bagel. And then the beauty of that is when they did that test, the exercise phys folks, they kind of like debriefed it a little bit, like, we'd never seen anything like that before. But what fascinated them was the recovery, because I went from, my max heart rate was like 180. Within a minute, it was down to like 80. So VO2 max, so like that, somehow like the recovery. So, when you're just doing all out effort, you're like gassed for like 5 minutes. There's something about when your body develops this really efficient fat burning engine that, even if you're like pushing effort, like you're fine, right? You don't beat yourself up. So your recovery is like miraculously nothing. You feel good. But yeah, I've been low carb, and, if I do these marathons and ultras, I don't, and it's beautiful, probably like you develop like a very specific plan just to maybe regulate your glucose, but 100% your stomach's not going to go, because you don't really need your stomach. There's not really this advanced nutrition strategy, because your nutrition strategy is your metabolism. And then you can kind of just feel what you need for electrolytes, maybe a little calorie, but you're not going to be limited by, gosh, I couldn't hold down 400 calories an hour because I was running too hard, and my stomach went. And that's probably, an Ironman and ultras, that's one of the biggest reasons people just, stop or just have horrible days, right? They somehow, whatever that plan for their nutrition, which involved a lot of nutrition, went south. So if your nutrition plan does not involve a lot of nutrition, that's a good place to be. But I think it's for human health, so you did the faster study. What really was fascinating in that study were the low carb group of endurance athletes versus the high carb. Wasn't really the performance stuff, but like, the lipid markers, these markers of metabolic health. So the people in the low carb arm, forget about how fast they ran. They were healthier human specimens at the end of that study by all markers that we could measure in Western medicine than the group that were the higher carb athletes. But I don't know if you want to throw any other questions in there on that.
Yeah.
It's very individualized based on your level of insulin resistance and metabolic needs for your health first. Forget about your performance. Like, what do you need? I made this change not to be able to run better or run marathons without power bars and gels. I did it to stay out of diabetes, to keep those glucoses remarkably stable.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers Podcast with Zach Bitter.